In a previous video, we looked at the requirements to create a React app, and the way we demonstrated that is we created an EC2 instance based on Ubuntu Linux, and then we connected to that EC2 instance and installed Node.js, which allowed us to create our React app. So I want to use that as a starting point. So I have my EC2 instance running, and I have my public DNS. I have SSH'd into that EC2 instance, and right now I'm in the home Ubuntu directory, which is really the root directory for that user account. I've installed Node, so if I look, I have Node installed. That installation happened already. And because of that, I can use the create React app process to create a React application. So what I want to do with this video is I want to create a React app. I want to commit that React app to source code, and then I want to kick off a code pipeline that's going to take that source code from GitHub and compile it, and build it essentially, not necessarily compile it, but build it into some static files, some HTML, some JavaScript, some CSS, some images, and then deploy it over to an S3 bucket so that I have a publicly accessible website. So there's quite a few things that are going to happen here, and we'll walk through each of those steps. So the first step is let's create our React app and commit it to GitHub. So two things. First, let's go ahead and kick off this npx create React app, and then I'm going to name my app Cloud for Developers. Okay, so that's going to go ahead and kick off that process of creating the React app. While that's happening, okay, so I'm going to let that happen. While that's happening, I'm going to create a source code repository on GitHub. So over on GitHub, I'm going to create a new repository. My repository name is going to be Cloud for Developers, so I'm going to actually match the folder name and my repository name. I'm going to make it public, and I'm going to create the repository. Okay, so life's good there. And it's telling me, how do I create a repository from the command line or push to an existing? So what I want to be able to do is I want to add this remote origin or this remote store. So I'm going to have to do that. So I'm going to go back over here. So the React app is getting created within my EC2 instance. One thing I will say is, since we're going to be setting up a code pipeline, the way code pipeline works is it uses the dependencies that we have. So just keep in mind that we installed Node on this EC2 instance. In order for my code pipeline to work, I'm going to need Node so that I can use these commands for my application. So if you remember, we eventually want to build this for a production build. npm comes with Node, so I'm going to have to install Node on the machine that's actually going to build my source code. Okay, so we have our application, and I'm still using the same EC2 instance that I used from the previous video. So I can go into my application, so I can go into my Cloud for Developers application, and I can use this npm start. And what'll happen is that'll start up. And I say that I'm still using that same EC2 instance. What that does is it allows me to access that EC2 instance because I've punched a hole in the firewall. So I have an incoming rule saying port 3000 is okay to access. So right now I'm trying to access it on port 80 because I didn't specify a port number. But now I'm going to specify port 3000, and you can see my React application. It's running. Okay, so life's good there. My create React app seemed to work. I'm going to go ahead and stop it. What I want to do is I want to commit my source code to Git. So I'm going to say git add all of the source code. And then in order for me to actually push that out to the server, I'm going to commit it with some message. So my message will be my initial commit. Okay, so there's working clean. Why am I not committing that? Yep. And then if I go back over to Git, I want to add my remote origin. So I'm just copying that. So I'm adding a reference to the remote origin. And then I should be able to push to the origin on the master branch. It asks me for a username and a password for GitHub. And you'll see that it's writing files. And if I go to GitHub now, so it was an empty repository, now if I just refresh this page, you'll see that I have my various files that were created from that create React app. And you can see this project was bootstrapped from create React app. It has that README file. That's what this README file is. Okay, so I have a React app, and life's good there. So what I want to do is I would now want to set up a build spec file. Okay, so the build spec file is basically going to say what should actually happen during the build process. So when we look at how do I actually deploy this and what are the prerequisite things, all of that's going to be defined within a build spec file. And the build spec file is going to be important. The indentation is going to be important, things like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up an inline text editor to create a buildspec.yaml file. So I'm going to say, go ahead and run this command as an administrator. And the command that I want to run is nano, which is that inline text editor. And the file that I want to create is buildspec.yaml. Okay, so I have a new file, and I just want to show you some of the commands. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control-O to write out this file. And then you'll notice the prompt says the file name to write is buildspec.yaml. And I'm just going to go ahead and hit Enter saying, yep, that's correct. And now if I do a directory listing, I'm going to exit using Control-X. I'm going to discard the changes. Okay, but you'll notice that there is this buildspec.yaml. Okay, so in a previous video, we talked about code build in AWS, and that's where this buildspec.yaml comes from. So code build is part of the pipeline process. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify that buildspec.yaml. So I'm going to use nano again. Okay, and the way this is going to work is I'm going to say the version that I want to use is 0.2. And then I'm going to have some phases. And I'm going to have the install phase. And the install phase is going to have a couple of commands. And the commands are going to be, first thing that I have to install is I have to install Node. Okay, so if you remember back to our previous video where we used our Create React app, we installed Node. And the way we installed Node is we went out to the Node.js site and we said we want to go to the downloads. And we're looking for installing Node via a package manager. And then we were on Ubuntu. And then there was a link out here that gave us instructions for how to install different versions of Node. So if we scroll down, there was a couple commands that we used to install Node, and they're right here. Okay, so one thing I will say is that all the commands that we will run through code build are going to run as the root user account. So we're going to get rid of that sudo command, but everything else is going to stay. So I'm going to copy this, but I do have to get rid of that sudo. Okay, so the command that I want is everything, but I'm going to get rid of the sudo -e. Okay, so that's the first command that I want. And I do need a dash in front of it to indicate that's the first item. I do the same thing. And then that sets up the source repository. Now I want to actually do the install. So again, I don't need the sudo, but I do need the apt-get install. Okay, so those are the commands that I need to install. Then I'm going to have some pre-build commands. And that's at the same level as the install. So pre-build. And then the commands. And the only command that I need here is Node has, well, I shouldn't say Node. So the way React works, so let's actually talk about React a little bit, is Node works, or React works based on these Node packages. And the Node packages that are required to run a React application are defined in your package.json file. And I mentioned that I don't want those package.json files. I don't want all of those Node packages or Node modules installed and committed to source code because I'm not in charge of them. I just want to use them. What happens is I have this package.json that defines all my dependencies for my application, and then I want to use those specific dependencies that I have, and the way I do that is I just use the command npm install to go grab all the dependencies that are defined in my package.json file. So if I actually look at my source code, so this Cloud for Developers, there's this package.json file, and this is telling me all of the different Node module package dependencies that I have. And this is the file. But I don't actually have these packages committed to my source code repository. If I did, there would be a node_modules folder. My project requires them, but I don't have them. All I have is a list of the dependencies. In order to actually grab that source code, to actually grab those dependent node modules, I have to come back over and issue a command called npm install. Okay, so that's going to install all of those dependencies. Then I'm ready to build, and I'm going to have some commands. And the commands that I'm going to have, just one, will be npm run build. And then I should be all set. That's going to build my React application. However, I'm going to have some artifacts now. So the indentation is important here. So phases, I have 3 phases, the install phase, the pre-build, and then the build phase. And then each of those phases has different commands that are relevant to those phases. And then after those phases execute, then I'm going to have artifacts. I'll have some files. And the files that I want are all of the files. So the syntax for that is 2 stars, a // and a star. I'm not going to discard any of my paths. I want to keep the paths. And then the base directory. So what's going to end up happening is I'm going to run this npm run build. It's going to build my React application, the static files, the HTML and the JavaScript with the dependencies kind of built in, it's going to create a directory called build that has all of those artifacts. So the base directory is going to be build. Okay, and then this should be my build spec.yaml. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control O to save the file. It says write out down at the bottom, so Control O. It says, are you sure you want to save to this file? I'm going to hit Enter, and then I'm going to exit. So I'm going to hit Control X to exit. Okay, and now I have that build spec.yaml. So what I can do is I can say git add build spec.yaml, and then I can say git commit with my message, added build spec, git commit. Yeah, it's basically saying I should configure my email and stuff like that. And I have it configured on my host machine, but I'm not doing that inside of my EC2 instance, but it did commit it. And now I should be able to just use the up arrow to push my file out to my remote repository. Okay, so now if I look at my remote repository, you can see that there is this build spec file. Okay, so now I think based on my source code, I'm ready to go to actually make changes and create this pipeline that's going to ultimately deploy my code out to an S3 bucket. So I'm going out to the AWS console and I'm in the code pipeline right here. And I am just going to go to code pipeline. This is what it looks like. There's no code pipelines. I want to create one. And the pipeline that I want to create, I can choose anything that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and call this Cloud for Developers. I am going to need a role, and I'm going to allow code pipeline to create that role, so I can go to next. The source provider that I'm going to use is GitHub. That's where my source code's coming from. Okay, and I'm going to connect this pipeline to GitHub. It's going to ask me to authenticate. So I've already authenticated, so you'll notice it came through pretty quickly. And then it's going to say, which repository do you want? And you'll notice that since I authenticated, it has that repository that we just created. And the branch that I want is the master branch. Okay, and then GitHub webhooks is how I'm going to start my pipeline. So that's fine. My build provider, I'm going to use AWS Code Build. Okay, I could also use Jenkins, but I'm going to use AWS Code Build. I'm going to use the AWS ecosystem here. And the region I'm currently in, US East 2, so that's fine. The project name, so this project is my code build project. So I'm going to create a new build project. So you can see I'm in the build stage. I'm going to create a new build project. Okay, so my project name is going to be Cloud for Developers Code Build. The operating system that I'm going to use. So what we're really talking about here is I'm going to use an operating system. So I'm going to have a machine that's dedicated to building my source code. That's where that build spec file is coming into play. So I want that to as closely mimic my development environment as I possibly can. I used Ubuntu, so I'm going to go ahead and use Ubuntu again. The runtime that I'm going to use is standard, and the image is just the standard 1.0. Okay, so all of that is fine. I am using a build spec file. I've already built the build spec file. By default, it's looking for build spec.yaml. That's what we named it, so we don't have to change the name here. And we're going to continue to our code pipeline. So that's our build project. And our build project is really heavily dependent on the fact that we have that build spec.yaml. Okay, so now it fills in our project name, Cloud for Developers Code Build. and we can continue to the next stage, which is how we're going to deploy this thing. So our deployment provider, we want to deploy our application over to S3. I think S3 is a perfect spot to host a React application. It's really inexpensive hosting. So I'm going to use S3, and it's saying, which bucket do you want to deploy this to? Well, right now I have S3 completely empty, so I have no buckets. What I want to do is I want to create a bucket where I'm going to deploy my application. So I'm going to go ahead and create a bucket called Cloud for Developers. And I want to allow public access because this is going to be a website, a publicly accessible website. So I'm not going to block public access. I'm going to acknowledge it. If I go into the advanced settings, I don't really need to do anything there. I'm going to create the bucket. I'm going to go into the bucket right away, and I'm going to enable static hosting. So under properties, there's the static website hosting. I'm just going to click on it. I'm going to say use this bucket, and the file that I want to use is index.html. So that's the URL, or that's the default page when I access this Cloud for Developers bucket. So this is where I want to deploy my React application, is I want it to go into this Cloud for Developers bucket. Okay, so back in code pipeline, it's saying which bucket. Well, I don't have any results. I can't even type it. I have to switch the regions. So if I switch from US East to US East, Ohio, now it'll find that bucket. And then it's asking for this object key. The object key is really what file within the bucket, but I don't want that. What ends up happening is code build builds a zip file. That's the resulting artifact. What I want to do is I want to take that zip file, the resulting artifact from code build, and I want to extract those files. So I'm going to extract the file before actually deploying it. So I want to unzip those files, then deploy it to my bucket Cloud for Developers. Okay. Then it says, here's all the things that you told me about. Let's review this. So I'm going to go ahead and create that pipeline. Okay, so the pipeline's there. So it's recognizing that there's some source code, it's in progress, the build hasn't run, the deploy hasn't run. Okay, so in progress right now, you can kind of see the wheels spinning. Now it goes into the build phase, and that's in progress. So we're kind of waiting on that build to happen. Okay, and one thing I want to show you before we actually see this all work or not work, we're kind of anticipating the results, and I'm assuming that things will work. But again, that's not always accurate. I want to go back over to my terminal, and I want to look at that directory for my application. So you'll notice that if I do a directory listing, there's the README, there's the build spec, there's node modules, there's the package.json, there's public, there's source code. And the reason I want to show you that is because what actually gets deployed is the compiled output. So we don't have the compiled output here. We just have the original source code. And if I wanted to make changes, I'd want to work with the source code. But the truth is eventually we're going to compile this, or build it essentially, into HTML and JavaScript that's static. So S3 does static web hosting. It will not execute code. It will not execute source code. It does static hosting. We have a JavaScript application, because that's what React is, and the code's not executing within S3. The code's actually going to execute on the client's machine because it's JavaScript. So I just want you to recognize eventually our S3 bucket's going to be populated, but it's not going to be populated with our source code. It's going to be populated with our built output. Okay, and now you'll see the build succeeded and the deploy succeeded. So now if I go back over to S3, and I'm going to actually refresh this to show you a couple things. So S3 is actually going to have two buckets now. And I'm not sure why I'm not seeing those two buckets. I should be seeing two buckets. There we go. So my code pipeline creates my artifact, my Cloud for Developers build and source artifacts. And then if I go back over to my Cloud for Developers, this is what I was talking about. I want you to recognize this is not what we are looking at. It does not have that source directory. It does not have the node modules directory. Like, this is the built React application. Okay, so now I want to be able to see this website. It'd be nice to be able to see. So I'm going to go back over to my bucket properties in static web hosting. There's a URL right here, cloudfordevelopers.s3. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. So I'm just going to click on it. It opens in a new tab and it says, hey, you don't have access. But I had set the bucket up so that I had public access. Okay, so here's the downfall of that is the bucket, I have public access, but all of the objects that got deployed there do not have public access. Okay, so I'm getting access denied on the individual objects within the bucket. In order to fix that, I'm going to create a bucket policy. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to the permissions, and I'm going to create a bucket policy. And in order to write the policy, I'm going to use the policy generator. Okay, so the type of policy I'm creating is an S3 bucket policy. I'm going to allow everyone, so star, access to S3. The object or the action that I want is get object. So if I scroll down far enough, eventually there's a get object. I had scrolled past it there for a second. And then the Amazon resource name, I want to provide access to that bucket. So here's the bucket that I want. Here's the policy. So I want ARN : AWS : my bucket name, which is Cloud for Developers. And then the key name that I want is /star. Okay, so I'm going to add that condition. Resource field is not valid. It does not like my ARN. And where I'd get my ARN typically is right here. So I'm not sure what I did wrong. I forgot the S3. So AWS : S3, then Cloud for Developers. So I had forgot a step there. I'm going to go ahead and add that statement. And then I'm going to generate the policy. Okay, so this is the policy that I want for my bucket. So I'm just copying that. And then I'm going to paste it into my bucket policy editor. And I'm going to save that. So what that does is now my bucket has public access, and all the resources within the bucket have public access. So now I had this 403 error saying it's forbidden. And eventually, I'm not sure why I'm not seeing my React app. There we go. Something must have been cached. Here's my React application. Okay, so now it's telling me edit source app.js, save and reload it, and then have a link out to learn React. Let's say I wanted to make a change. So I'm going to say, instead of edit, I'm going to say do not edit. I want to change this. Okay, and I know this is in app.js. That's where the code resides. So I'm going to go into the source folder, and then there's an app.js file. So I'm going to open that with a text editor, so nano. So you'll notice right here is that paragraph saying edit app.js. So I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to say do not edit. I'm going to go ahead and save it, and I'm going to exit. I'm going to commit my changes. Modified app.js to say do not edit. Okay. Why did that not commit that? Change is not staged for commit. app.js. I've modified it. I want to do. Now I should be able to commit. And now I should be able to push this file. Okay, so I'm just pushing that edited file out to GitHub. So I make the change, commit it to Git. Okay, and if I go out to GitHub, we should see that file. So under source, here's app.js modified to say do not edit 25 seconds ago. You can see the change on GitHub. And because I made that change, we can go back to code pipeline. You can see that the build is in progress right now because of GitHub getting changed. There's a webhook there. So all of my code is getting built. And then once the code is built, it's going to automatically deploy it to my S3 bucket again. And my S3 bucket is all configured so that I'm not running on port 3000. Okay, so eventually what's going to happen is I'm going to have the do not edit here once this code pipeline progress actually completes. And we're monitoring it here and we're visually verifying that everything was successful. The reality is as soon as I kicked off that push command out to GitHub, it kicked off this code pipeline, and the code pipeline started this chain of events that ultimately ends up in my code getting deployed correctly out to S3. So any code changes that I commit to my source code repository are going to instantly, and I say instantly, kind of no touch, get deployed to my S3 bucket. So the build takes a little while. The deployment is usually pretty quick. So the deployment happened just now. So my S3 bucket should now be reflected with that change, and you'll see that that source code change made it through to my S3 bucket. So now my workflow is I make changes to my React application, I commit those to GitHub, and then that automatically kicks off the process of deploying my React application out to my S3 bucket. And then I can see those changes as soon as that process is complete. Okay, so this is my continuous integration, continuous delivery pipeline that I'm going to use for my React applications within the AWS ecosystem.